Publikum restlos uns gehört, der sich als Träger seines besten Blutes fühlen und dieses wissend.
Millions dead, cities wiped off the face of the earth, continents engulfed in the flames of war. All of this was the consequence of the decisions of one man, Adolf Hitler. His ambitions dragged nearly the entire world into conflict and turned the 20th century into a stage for destruction on an unprecedented scale. His regime became a symbol of what fanaticism, hatred, and an unrestrained thirst for power can lead to. The history of his rule is not only a chronicle of war, but also a study of human suffering, grief, and tears. The aftermath of this tragedy is measured in millions of lost lives, generational trauma, and a world that learned forever how devastating power built on hatred can be. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, in the small border town of Braunau am Inn, in what was then Austria-Hungary. This town lay right on the border with Germany, a symbolic detail, considering that later Hitler would consider himself German rather than Austrian. His father, Alois Hitler, was a civil servant, strict, authoritarian, and quick-tempered. The household was governed by rigid discipline, and physical punishment was considered normal. The relationship between father and son was cold and conflict-ridden. Alois wanted Adolf to become a government official, but from an early age, Adolf dreamed of something entirely different. The only person close to him was his mother, Clara Hitler. She was gentle, caring, and sincerely supportive of her son. Her death in 1907 was a severe psychological blow for Hitler, the consequences of which would affect him throughout his life. At school, Adolf's performance was inconsistent. In the early years, he did fairly well, but over time, he became lazy, stubborn, and argumentative. He was particularly interested in history and architecture, immersing himself in stories of great empires, wars, and powerful leaders. Even then, he was drawn to the idea of greatness and authority. After his father's death, Hitler finally decided to devote himself to art. He moved to Vienna with the dream of becoming an artist, but reality proved harsh. The Vienna Academy of Fine Arts rejected him twice, deeming his work mediocre. This failure became a turning point. Hitler was left without an education, a profession, or a stable income. He lived in homeless shelters, survived on odd jobs, and gradually developed feelings of humiliation, anger, and hatred toward the world around him. It was in Vienna that he first encountered radical nationalist and anti-Semitic ideas, which were widely spread at the time. These beliefs did not arise out of nowhere. They found fertile ground in his existing feelings of disappointment, loneliness, and inner resentment. Hitler's childhood and youth tell the story not of a genius or a demon, but of a man who could not cope with failure and began searching for someone to blame around him. The question remains, how did the personal complexes of a single individual eventually escalate into a catastrophe of global proportions? When Europe descended into chaos in the summer of 1914, Adolf Hitler was an unemployed artist living in Munich, a man without a family, without money, and without a clear future. But the war gave him something he had been searching for all along: purpose, belonging, and direction. As soon as Germany announced mobilization, Hitler volunteered for the Bavarian army. He was not drafted. He actively wanted to go to war. For him, it was more than duty. It was a chance to prove his loyalty to Germany, a country he deeply idealized. He was assigned to the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment, known as the List Regiment. Hitler served as a messenger, one of the most dangerous roles on the battlefield. His job was to run between command posts and frontline trenches, often under heavy artillery fire. Many soldiers around him were killed, yet Hitler survived, reinforcing his belief that he was somehow destined for something greater. At the front, he showed strict discipline, unquestioning obedience, and intense devotion to Germany. He was not a charismatic leader among his comrades. Instead, he remained a quiet and isolated figure, spending his free time reading newspapers, writing letters, and thinking about the fate of the nation. In 1916, Hitler was wounded in the leg during the Battle of the Somme, one of the bloodiest battles of the war. After recovering, he returned to the front. In 1918, he was awarded the Iron Cross First Class, a rare honor for a common soldier. To Hitler, this confirmed his self-image as a heroic and loyal servant of Germany. But the most important turning point did not happen on the battlefield. In the autumn of 1918, Hitler was temporarily blinded during a gas attack and sent to a military hospital. It was there that he learned of Germany's surrender. The news devastated him. He did not see defeat as a military failure, but as a betrayal from within. During this time, the idea of the stab in the back took root in his mind. The belief that Germany's army had been betrayed by politicians, socialists, and Jews. This moment marked the psychological birth of the future Nazi leader. When the war ended, Hitler returned to a defeated, humiliated Germany, angry, radicalized, and convinced that the nation needed a new order. And from this defeat, a man emerged who would soon change the course of world history. After the end of the First World War, Germany felt as if it had woken up in a foreign country. The empire was gone, the Kaiser had abdicated, and in its place stood the fragile Weimar Republic, weak, divided, and despised by many Germans. It was into this broken and confused Germany that Adolf Hitler returned, a soldier who could not accept defeat. In 1919, while still in the army, Hitler was assigned to monitor a small radical group, the German Workers' Party. He arrived as an observer, but left as its future leader. His speech made such an impression that he was immediately invited to join the party. Gradually, Hitler realized something crucial. His true weapon was not a rifle, but his voice. His speeches had an almost hypnotic effect on people. He did not just speak, he ignited emotions. By the early 1920s, the party had been renamed the NSDAP, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Hitler turned it into his personal platform: red flags, the swastika symbol, the paramilitary SA, and a growing cult of personality around himself. The movement was becoming more than politics. It was turning into a mix of fanatic hatred and nationalist revival. Meanwhile, Germany was sinking deeper into chaos. The hyperinflation of 1923 destroyed the middle class. People carried money in wheelbarrows, spent their wages in a single day, and elderly citizens lost their life savings overnight. Street clashes between communists and far-right groups became common, and the country seemed on the brink of civil war. It was at this moment that Hitler decided to seize power by force. In November 1923, he attempted a coup in Munich, the famous beer hall putsch. He burst into a political meeting at gunpoint, declared a revolution, and tried to lead nationalist forces in a march toward Berlin. But it ended in disaster. Police opened fire, the coup failed, and Hitler was arrested. To many, it seemed that his political career was over. Yet it was in prison that a turning point occurred. While incarcerated, Hitler did not simply reflect. He organized his ideology. There he wrote Mein Kampf, My Struggle. This was not an ordinary autobiography. In it, he outlined his vision of a racial hierarchy, named Jews as Germany's main enemy, justified future aggression in Eastern Europe, and effectively laid out the blueprint for a future dictatorship. At the time, many people dismissed the book. Some saw it as the rantings of a fanatic. Others thought it was too extreme to ever become reality. But for Hitler himself, it became the foundation of his future rule. When he was released from prison in 1924, Germany had changed, and so had he. He understood one key lesson. Power could be taken not only by force, but through democracy itself. From that moment on, he was no longer just a revolutionary. He became a strategist. The second half of the 1920s became a period of preparation. Hitler traveled across Germany, held rallies, built his party machine, and transformed the Nazi Party into a disciplined, centralized organization. Then came the real opportunity, the Great Depression of 1929. Germany's economy collapsed. Millions were unemployed. The government appeared weak and helpless. Against this backdrop, Hitler looked like the only man who knew what to do. His rallies turned into massive spectacles, marching columns, flaming torches, roaring slogans, and crowds chanting his name. He no longer looked like a fringe extremist. He looked like a national leader. By 1932, the Nazis had become the largest party in the Reichstag. Germany was in political deadlock. No government could function without Hitler's support. And then came the decision that changed history. In January 1933, German elites, President Hindenburg, industrial leaders, and conservative politicians, decided to appoint Hitler as chancellor. They believed they could control him, use his popularity, and keep him in check. They were tragically wrong. A month later, the Reichstag building was set on fire. Hitler seized on this event as a pretext to declare a state of emergency, arrest his political opponents, and dismantle democracy itself. Within just a few months, Germany ceased to be a republic. Opposition parties were banned, freedom of speech was destroyed, and mass repression began. The first concentration camps were established. And so, the man who had once been a homeless soldier, a failed coup plotter, and a political prisoner became the absolute dictator of Germany. Ahead loomed a war on a scale the world had never seen, though in 1933, such a catastrophe still seemed unthinkable to most people. Now imagine yourself living in Germany at that time. Would you have supported Hitler as the savior of the nation, or would you have recognized him as a threat while there was still time? When Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, many saw it as a temporary political experiment. Conservatives believed they could control him. The elites assumed he could be managed. The public hoped for stability after the chaos of the Weimar Republic. But it soon became clear that Germany had not just gained a new politician, it had placed power in the hands of a man determined to reshape history. Within just a few months of his appointment, Hitler systematically dismantled German democracy. The Reichstag fire provided the perfect pretext for declaring a state of emergency. Under the guise of fighting internal enemies, thousands were arrested and sent to prisons and the first concentration camps. Political opposition was destroyed, independent media was silenced, and parliament was reduced to a meaningless formality. Germany was no longer a republic. It had become a state ruled by the will of one man. But dictatorship was only the beginning. Alongside political terror, the Nazi regime began molding a new ideology for society. In schools, students were taught not to think critically, but to obey. In universities, racial theories were promoted as scientific truth. In the military, soldiers were prepared not just for service, but for future war. Step by step, Germany was transforming into a machine built for aggression. A central role in this transformation was played by anti-Semitic policy. Jews became the main target of Nazi propaganda. They were blamed for everything, from Germany's defeat in World War I to economic hardship. At first, they were pushed out of professions, stripped of rights, and humiliated in public life. But each year, repression grew more brutal. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 effectively excluded Jews from the German nation. Then, in 1938, came Kristallnacht, a state-organized wave of violence across Germany. Synagogues burned, Jewish businesses were destroyed, and tens of thousands were arrested and sent to camps. The world watched in horror, yet did little to intervene. At the same time, Hitler was preparing Germany for war. He openly violated the Treaty of Versailles, rebuilt the army, and invested heavily in tanks, aircraft, and warships. In 1936, German troops marched into the demilitarized Rhineland, a direct challenge to Europe. The Western powers chose not to respond. Encouraged by this inaction, Hitler went further. In 1938, Germany annexed Austria. This was followed by the crisis over the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, which ended with the Munich Agreement, an attempt to appease the aggressor. Instead of preventing war, it only strengthened Hitler's confidence. Finally, on September 1, 1939, German tanks crossed into Poland. At that moment, it became clear. The world had entered the most devastating war in human history. Germany had traveled from democracy to dictatorship, from humiliation to aggression, and from revenge to global catastrophe. But the central question remains. If Europe had stopped Hitler earlier, could history have been different, or was war inevitable? After the Anschluss of Austria and the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, it became unmistakably clear. Hitler was not merely revising the Treaty of Versailles. He was systematically redrawing the map of Europe by force. Western powers responded with protests and diplomacy rather than action, which only strengthened his confidence that he could act without serious consequences. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and the world plunged into the Second World War. Poland fought with extraordinary courage, but it was caught in a deadly pincer movement. The German blitzkrieg struck from the west, while units of the Red Army advanced from the east under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Within weeks, the Polish state ceased to exist as an independent power. Yet Poland was only the first domino in a chain of rapid conquests. In 1940, Hitler turned his armies to the west, and Europe began to fall with alarming speed, one country after another. Denmark and Norway were the first to collapse almost immediately. Their resistance was brief. German forces quickly seized key ports, airfields, and capitals, securing control over the North Atlantic and strategic routes to Scandinavia. Next came the assault on the Netherlands and Belgium. Their armies fought bravely, but they were overwhelmed by coordinated tank offensives and relentless air attacks from the Luftwaffe. Within days, German forces broke through, and major cities came under occupation. The climax of this campaign was France. Widely regarded as the strongest land power in Europe, it fell in just 6 weeks. The Maginot Line was outflanked, military command disintegrated, and political will collapsed. German troops marched into Paris, and the Nazi flag flew over the city, a powerful symbol of Europe's humiliation. By this point, it seemed as though Europe was surrendering itself to Hitler with astonishing ease. Nations fell like dominoes, and the Third Reich expanded at an unprecedented pace. However, Germany then encountered its first major obstacle, Great Britain. In the Battle of Britain, Hitler sought to break the country through massive aerial bombardment, destroy its air force, and prepare for an invasion. But the Royal Air Force held firm. British cities withstood the bombing, and the Luftwaffe suffered heavy losses. For the first time, the war machine of the Reich hit a real limit. The expansion that had swept across the continent now stalled over the English Channel. Britain did not fall, and this marked a strategic setback for Hitler. Meanwhile, nearly all of continental Europe was either under direct Nazi occupation or firmly within Berlin's sphere of influence, from Norway in the north to the Balkans in the south, from the Atlantic coast in the west to the borders of the Soviet Union in the east. Collaborationist regimes were installed in several countries, while resistance movements went underground. It was against this backdrop, after sweeping victories in Europe and failure in Britain, that Hitler made his most fateful decision. Instead of continuing the struggle in the west, he chose to pursue Lebensraum in the east. Preparations for the invasion of the Soviet Union began, setting the stage for the bloodiest phase of the war. The greatest gamble of his life was made when Europe already lay at Adolf Hitler's feet. Victories in the West reinforced his belief in his own infallibility. He was convinced that the next step was inevitable: war against the Soviet Union. Hitler hated communism as an ideology, regarded it as the mortal enemy of Nazism, and saw the USSR not as an equal opponent, but as an artificially constructed and weak state, sustained, in his view, only by fear and propaganda. The invasion of Bolshevik Russia was, in Hitler's mind, not merely a military campaign, but an ideological mission. He believed that the destruction of communism would open Germany's path to global domination, while the eastern territories would become a source of resources and so-called living space. The Soviet people, as he imagined them, were incapable of prolonged resistance, and the Red Army was poorly organized and doomed to rapid defeat. The development of Operation Barbarossa in 1940 gave formal shape to these convictions. Hitler viewed the war in the East as a decisive blow that would eliminate the Soviet Union in the shortest possible time. German military leadership planned a lightning war to crush the USSR within a few months and avoid a prolonged conflict. In June 1941, these plans were put into action. Without a declaration of war, German forces crossed the Soviet border, launching the largest invasion in history. In the first weeks of the offensive, Berlin's calculations appeared justified. The Wehrmacht advanced rapidly, encircling and destroying Soviet armies and seizing vast territories. The capitals of Soviet republics fell. Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, was captured. Key cities in Belarus were occupied, and the front continued to push relentlessly eastward. These successes only strengthened Hitler's confidence in an imminent victory. It seemed as though the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. However, the decisive test came with the Battle of Moscow. It was here that the concept of blitzkrieg began to fracture. The German advance stalled, confronted by fierce resistance, supply failures, and the brutal winter. For the first time, the Wehrmacht suffered a major defeat, and the illusion of an easy victory over the Soviet Union began to fade. The failure before Moscow was not merely a military setback, but a strategic turning point. Germany lost what mattered most, the initiative and the belief in its own invincibility. The war Hitler had imagined as short and decisive turned into a prolonged war of attrition for which the Third Reich was unprepared. It was here, in the winter of 1941, that the countdown began, from ambitions of world domination to inevitable collapse. After the defeat near Moscow, it became clear that the Blitzkrieg had failed. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht had been stopped, and the myth of Germany's invincibility had cracked. Yet Hitler refused to accept reality. He demanded new offensives, new sacrifices, and more bloodshed. In the winter of 1942 to 1943, the war reached the banks of the Volga. Stalingrad became hell on earth. The city was reduced to ruins, and fighting raged for every house, basement, and staircase. The German Sixth Army found itself encircled, cut off from supplies. Hitler forbade retreat, a decision that proved disastrous. In February 1943, Paulus's army surrendered. It was the first crushing defeat of the Reich in the East, and a decisive turning point of the war. But Hitler still believed in revenge. In the summer of 1943, he committed his best forces to a new offensive, the Battle of Kursk. It became the largest tank battle in history. German Tigers and Panthers collided with a deeply prepared Soviet defense and massive counterattacks. Instead of a breakthrough, the Wehrmacht suffered another defeat. From that moment on, the initiative permanently shifted to the Red Army. While Germany was bleeding in the east, a second front opened in the west. In June 1944, the Allied landing in Normandy, Operation Overlord, began. Thousands of ships, aircraft, and soldiers stormed the beaches of France. German defenses crumbled. Within months, the Allies liberated Paris and advanced rapidly toward the borders of the Reich. By early 1945, Germany was trapped between two fronts. Soviet forces pressed from the east, while Americans, British, and French advanced from the west. German cities lay in ruins, the economy was destroyed, the army exhausted, and the Nazi regime was collapsing from within. In April 1945, the Battle of Berlin began, the final great confrontation of the war in Europe. The Red Army encircled the capital of the Reich. Fighting raged street by street, block by block. Berlin was burning, its streets choked with rubble, and the last defenders, teenagers from the Hitler Youth and battered soldiers, could no longer halt the Soviet advance. At the same time, Hitler hid in his underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. He was physically frail, mentally broken, and completely detached from reality. Maps on the walls showed offensives that no longer existed, and orders were issued to armies that had already been destroyed. His inner circle was disintegrating. Some fled, others tried to negotiate with the Allies, and the rest simply awaited the end. This moment marks one of the final recorded images of Adolf Hitler. In this footage, he is seen shaking hands with members of the Hitler Youth in Berlin in April 1945, just days before the fall of the city. The scene stands in stark contrast to the collapsing reality around him, a symbolic closing image of a regime that was nearing its end. On the night of April 29th to 30th, 1945, Hitler married Eva Braun in a small, grim ceremony attended only by his closest associates, a symbolic act on the eve of their deaths. The next day, with Soviet troops fighting just hundreds of meters from the bunker, Hitler resolved that he would not surrender. According to eyewitness accounts, Eva Braun agreed to die alongside him. She voluntarily ingested cyanide, the same poison that had been prepared earlier for the Nazi leadership. Hitler, for his part, committed suicide with a firearm. Their bodies were carried into the courtyard of the Reich Chancellery, doused with gasoline, and burned in accordance with his prior instructions. With this act, not only did Adolf Hitler's life end, the very idea of the 1,000-year Reich, which lasted barely 12 years, collapsed as well. A few days later, Berlin fell. On May 8, 1945, Germany signed its unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. A man who promised his people a 1,000-year Reich left behind a nation in ruins. Cities were wiped off the map, millions were dead, an entire continent was divided for decades to come. Adolf Hitler took his own life in a bunker, never fully confronting the full scale of the catastrophe he had created. But the consequences of his decisions echoed for generations, in the Cold War, in a divided Germany, in new conflicts, and in a persistent fear that the past could repeat itself. Hitler's story is not just the story of one dictator. It is a warning of how economic crisis, national humiliation, propaganda, and fear can push a society toward radicalism, of how a cult of personality destroys critical thinking, and of how fragile democracy becomes when people stop defending. The real question is not who Hitler was. The real question is what conditions allowed him to rise to power, and whether those conditions could emerge again. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it often rhymes, and that is precisely why it must be remembered.